There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of sexual and physical violence. Listener discretion is advised. It's 1978 in the Californian city of Stockton. The warm weather means residents often leave their windows open, and for decades, people haven't been locking their doors. It's known as an exceptionally safe suburb. Bob and Gay Hardwick, a couple in their 20s, are asleep in the early hours of the morning. Suddenly, they're awoken by a bright light shining in their faces. A man is standing at the edge of their bed holding a gun, with a black ski mask covering his face. He threatens to kill them unless they cooperate with his demands. Over the next several hours, Gay Hardwick is sexually assaulted by the armed intruder, while Bob is tied up, unable to move. The intruder rummages through their home, stealing jewellery and spare change, before finally leaving. This man behind the mask would come to be known as the East Area Rapist, or the Golden State Killer, and for decades he would evade police. Then, in 2016, something remarkable happened. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Andrew Rule. Andrew's written about some of the biggest Australian crimes of the last 30 years and is currently a regular columnist with the Herald Sun, as well as the host of his own podcast, Life and Crimes with Andrew Rule. Throughout our interview, Andrew will be referencing a docu-series, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, featuring writer Michelle McNamara's investigation into the dark world of a violent predator she dubbed the Golden State Killer. Andrew's interest lies within DNA tracing, which later on became one of the most valuable tools to finding the Golden State Killer. One of the reasons Americans started locking their doors in the late 1970s was because a pretty terrifying story had begun circulating about a man in Northern California who was breaking into homes, and there had been a series of rapes. What did these attacks look like? What was the sort of routine that they appeared to be? You know, it was quite repetitive in terms of what this attacker was doing.
This offender, unknown male, was known to be youngish. He was known to hang around outside windows, creep up very quietly, look through windows. They would sometimes find his footprints, often sand shoes. He was quite prepared to break into places, and he would pry open windows or doors using some sort of leverage. He went prepared to break and enter, and he was someone who clearly thought about his offences before he committed them.
Once he entered the homes, what would he do if her husband was home or if a child was home? What did he do in that case? Now,
here's an awful thing, and I've seen a similar thing in this country, somewhat similar. He would effectively use the presence of another person to blackmail the woman into doing what he wanted because of the threat of the harm he could do to the child or to the partner. And what he would do, he would be able to tie up the male person, because he'd say, if you don't let me, tie you up, I'll harm her. And he would tie the man up on a bed, and he would place crockery on their back. And he would say, if you move, the crockery will fall off and make a crash, and I'll hear it. I will then kill or whatever, do something bad. And he would make that threat in order to prevent the men who were there in each case, the man that was there in each case, from retaliating or attempting to retaliate. He would really blackmail them emotionally so they wouldn't be able to do anything. It was a fiendishly simple plan, and yet it worked pretty well.
And did the victims recall any identifying features, anything that was unusual about his appearance that they could relay to police?
Interestingly, they got his height fairly right because witnesses are notoriously bad. We all are, all of us. And, we all know that when police are being trained, they suddenly in the middle of a classroom, two men will run in with, one with a gun and one with a knife. And later, after 15 seconds or something, the students will be asked to say what they saw, and inevitably they give very different answers. So witnesses are not reliable, but they managed to get this guy fairly right on his height, which is around 5'10", which is probably 178 in our measurements. And his physique, they had that reasonably right, that he was, a reasonably fair-skinned Caucasian. Beyond that, not overly, although I noticed that one of the sketches that was done from one of the crime scenes did seem to be very accurate. It did match up with photographs of the offender taken at the time and, of course, not seen by us until 40 years later. Yeah.
The victims also often said that they'd been getting strange phone calls in the weeks before. Yep. What would these phone calls consist of? What was happening on the other end of the phone?
Well, this is the usual range of perverse and predatory deviant behaviour, the heavy breathing, the sexual suggestions. He said to more than one woman, I think, I'm going to come over there and fuck you, that sort of stuff. So intimidating, sexualised and scary.
And these weren't the first crimes committed by this man. He would come to be known as the Golden State Killer, but he began by stealing, didn't he? And sort of rummaging through people's things. What would he take?
Well, here's the thing about deviant behaviour. It starts at some level and often escalates. And really, in decades of reporting on these sort of things, I've seen that nearly always, even really serious sex killers and very violent people, they usually started out doing smaller things that indicated they were capable of more. They're nearly always, peeping toms. They often are firelighters. And thieves, they break the rules. They're rule breakers, compulsive rule breakers. So this guy would steal stuff from around people's houses. He also stole stuff in shops, but he ended up losing a job as a policeman because of a theft. So he had that tendency to do anti-social things. He was a sociopath.
Do you think the fact that he was had worked as a police officer made him a more dangerous predator?
I do, because I think police officers, even at a reasonably basic level as he was, get to know how to handle people, how to exercise leverage of, power and influence, and sort of how to order people around and get them to do what you want them to do. They also understand how limited police reaction is and how long it will take police to get to the scene. So they're pretty good at judging when they can get away with something. And we've seen that before with rogue police. They're extremely good at handling the risk of being caught. And also, if they are pulled up driving away or something, they know how to diffuse the situation by saying, oh, yeah, g'day, I'm just doing this or that, and how to cover up their true motives and how not to look nervous.
If he'd committed a crime here in Exeter, he would come out and do the follow-up investigation, and there wouldn't be no evidence, because if he turned up any evidence, it'd probably most likely been him.
So we do see that with rogue coppers a lot, and some crooks who learn those same tricks have become extremely good at going through roadblocks and all the rest of it. And I think undoubtedly he had that in his favour.
Are there any parallels? Because he was the Golden State Killer or the East Area Rapist. I believe he was even referred to as the Night Stalker at one stage, because there were so many crimes being committed that the police, thought that this had to be multiple offenders. It wasn't possible that it was just one person. But is there any parallels between him and his behaviour and the crimes he committed and any cases in Australia in terms of the profile and the way he went about his crimes?
Look, there will be several, but the one I'm going to go to first is one that I know a lot about, so you'll forgive me for that. Back in the 1960s in Victoria, there was a notorious crime that it was committed only a few weeks after the Beaumont children disappeared in Adelaide, which of course is probably the most famous crime in post-war Australia. But this happened in Shepparton, which is, a large country town in Victoria. 2 teenagers, an 18-year-old guy and a 16-year-old girl. They weren't actually a couple per se, but on this particular night, they had been driving around Shepparton in the young guy's car, and they'd been hanging around with his mates, and there was a concert on that night, sort of a rock concert, and they disappeared. They were abducted, and in fact, they were murdered, but their bodies weren't found for about 10 days. This was the same week that decimal currency came in. It was an astonishing week. And that story became a massive story in my childhood because it was, the sort of thing that didn't really happen. But now it had, and it seemed to be a grave new world of where people could be abducted and killed. And that guy wasn't caught. It was just one of these huge mysteries. The police went through a lot of people and they bashed people and they interrogated hundreds of people, but they never looked like catching this killer. But 20 years later, they did catch him. He caught himself. He was caught exposing himself in Albury, New South Wales. He was routinely fingerprinted, and the fingerprint was matched up with the print left on the murdered boy's car. And 20 years later, the case was solved. And it was after that I was, by this stage, a young crime reporter, and I remembered the case extremely well from my childhood. And I wrote a book called Cuckoo about that entire case and about that man. His real name is Raymond Edmonds, but he became known before he was caught as Mr. Stinky, which was sort of like calling him the Night Stalker. And they called him Mr. Stinky because one of the alleged clues about him, when he became a serial rapist, which is the point we're getting to, this is a killer who is actually a sex offender, which I would suggest is the same as D'Angelo, that he was a sex offender who sort of killed sometimes rather than a serial killer per se. And Edmonds was the same. And really he had committed the double murder because he was interested in raping the girl, but he needed to get rid of the both of them because they were witnesses. So his motivation was primarily sexual. And so it proved over the next 19 years before his capture, he became a serial rapist all over Victoria, but particularly in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. As he moved around, the crime wave went with him. And in that sense, Raymond Edmonds in Victoria, Australia, was extremely similar to the Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer, and all the other names in California. Very similar case.
Yeah, absolutely. The DNA question is an interesting one. Were there rape kits between 1976, 1986, when the Golden State Killer was committing these crimes? Were they able to collect DNA in order to try and find him?
DNA was almost science fiction in that era, almost science fiction as far as law enforcement. I mean, there were people in laboratories looking at it, and it was the brave new world of forensic science. But at that stage, it wasn't the routine thing. Younger people, and in that, I guess you, have grown up sort of knowing that DNA is a thing. But in those days, it was fingerprints and hair samples and blood types. They'd find a bodily fluid and they could often tell if it was A positive or whatever it was. And they could use all those things. But DNA really wasn't a thing yet. With a bit of luck, some samples were kept, and sometimes they were kept well enough that they could later be used, many years later, run through the laboratory to see if they could match up old samples with later crimes. And sometimes that has worked. But often, sadly, the samples have deteriorated to the extent that they're not usable.
In 2013, I want to jump forward a bit because a woman named Michelle McNamara started writing extensively about the Golden State Killer. That's what she termed this man on her true crime blog.
Yeah.
That garnered enormous attention. What sort of insights did she have about who he might be?
Michelle McNamara is like hundreds of citizen detectives, let's call them. These are sort of true crime buffs. Some of them are true crime tragics or lunatics, some of them. And the thing they share is a sort of obsessive streak when it comes to research and investigating, trying to solve unsolved crimes. The difference with Michelle McNamara was that A, she was intelligent, and B, she was articulate, and C, she was a marvellous writer, a most beautiful writer. And I'm only judging this from her words that have been used in the documentary. And it was her power to describe what had happened and to describe the feelings of others and to describe her own feelings, which really made her work stand out from all the other dozens of citizen detectives who are, wonderful people and very clever, some of them. And in fact, she enlisted some very bright sparks to her cause. And between them all, they were quite a formidable investigative force in the sense that they were analysing material from all over the place in a way that was probably superior to what the professional detectives were doing, because they had one advantage over professional detectives. They didn't have to turn out at midnight and go to a fresh murder or whatever it might be. They were concentrating on the big picture of the Golden State Killer. And now that it's been reconstructed on film so cleverly, it really is a brilliant tale of the progress of a sex killer and rapist, and also of the obsession of a very fine writer in trying to find that killer.
With the Golden State Killer, I mean, he had been believed to have been guilty of 50 rapes and 13 murders at the time that Michelle McNamara started doing her research. Why do you think it was that at that stage, in 2013, decades after they'd actually stopped, they hadn't found him? Like, why do you think it had become so difficult to identify even a serious key suspect?
Once he stopped offending, your string of clues runs out. I mean, you've got the old clues, but at that point, so I think his last known offence was he killed a young girl, apparently after a 5-year hiatus. It would appear that he was living with his cousin or something for those 5 years, and when she left to go and get married or something, his situation altered, and he must have felt, psychologically weird, and he went out and he killed this poor girl, this 18-year-old girl. But once he stopped offending, the police have always got the latest fresh case of something else they've got to look at. They can't really devote the sort of obsessive man-hours that Michelle McNamara and her helpers could or did, and gradually goes to the bottom of the pile. And really it's only if there's something that stirs up, it might be an anniversary where, the media do an anniversary thing, 10th anniversary, 20th anniversary, that the police might get a bit of a stir along, and they're, the city hall might say, listen, what are you doing about this? And talk to the police chief, and he talks to the head of detectives, and they go and have another look. We do see that happen here in Australia quite a lot on anniversaries and things like that. We had one here in Victoria last week. It's a 40-year-old case, and because it's 40 years old in, August, they've announced a $1 million reward, hoping it loosens someone's tongue. So sometimes those things come along, and they're to some extent media-driven.
It's interesting because if you were him, you would think that by 2016 you'd gotten away with it, because it has been so many decades and no one's come for him.
Totally.
But in that year, the FBI released further information, and as you say, there was renewed interest for a number of reasons. Michelle McNamara's work likely had something to do with it. How did they use a sort of an ancestry site, I suppose America's version of what we've got here, Ancestry.com, where people build family trees or discover who they might be related to or what their family background is? How did they use that technology to actually find him?
Great minds do think alike. It makes sense that smart people who are aware of changes in forensic science are going to have the same idea. It's not a far-out idea. It's common sense. It's very commonsensical. I would have thought the average, crime author could think up such a scenario. And that's what Michelle McNamara was. She did have the gift of imagination, which is a very powerful thing when you're investigating, to use imagination, because then you can imagine what might have happened. And if you can imagine it, you can then go and test your theory. And what she thought was, and there was a change in the way DNA could be used. The tests got cheaper and they were able to be done by citizens, for a fairly cheap price. So everybody tracing their own family trees, by about 2016, say, they could put a little bit of spit in a bottle or whatever it was, send it off to the lab for $99 or whatever it is, and they could test the DNA against cousins and other people who had entered their DNA as well. And that meant you could build up a sort of family trees of people who were related to each other. Those people who had done this, you could work out if they had common ancestors. Everybody's got this little bit of DNA from great-great-granddad or whatever. And so it was that smart people like Michelle McNamara and possibly a detective in California have thought of this and thought, hang on, if enough people are doing this DNA test for genealogy, maybe if we get a DNA sample of this unknown Golden State Killer, when we've got some samples from the crime scenes, and we put that in the system, we'll see if there's any relatives of his who have put theirs in. And they got a hit. They put it in and they got a hit. They go, oh, this guy is related, our unknown offender is related to these people. It's only a very distant thing. All I could say is this, that he was descended from a couple in the 1800s. And so he shared some DNA, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people, distant third, fourth, fifth, sixth cousins, because what they shared was, I think, a great-great-great-grandparent, something like that, a real long time ago. But having worked that out, what they did then, instead of knocking on, 2,000 doors, they said, let's look through and find the ones that are going to be the right age, right gender, of course, male, right age, a male who's born between X and Y, so they made it probably 1930 till 1950 or whatever. They could work it out roughly, what the parameters were, and living in California at the relevant times. So they were able to shave it back to a manageable number of suspects. And guess what? It led straight to his door.
And what did they do once they found out that, this DNA match existed? What did they do to go and find DNA from him? Because you would be worried that he would run if police turned up and asked to get a swab. They actually went sort of almost through his rubbish, didn't they?
One citizen detective, she had a suspect who wasn't this suspect, it was someone else that she knew, and she'd taken a drink bottle that he'd used and said, I'd like the last of that, and took it with her and got it tested. What the police did for their suspect, who was the right one, and possibly many others, they went through the rubbish bins, the oldest trick in the book, and they got out, a tissue that he'd used. It had DNA on it, and were able to test it and then go, well, that's our man. Let's go and knock on his door. That scene of the police going to knock on his door when they arrested him not long ago, which was, of course, after the death of Michelle McNamara in 2016 when she died of a drug overdose. That scene, Michelle McNamara had sort of forecast in writing the last passage of her book, the book on which the documentary is based, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. And she wrote a compelling passage saying, this is how it ends. They'll come up the garden path and knock on the door, and you, some old man sitting somewhere thinking you'd got away with it for all these years, you'll have to step into the light. I've just paraphrased what she wrote, but what she wrote was the perfect words. She was a wonderful writer, motivated by an obsessive force, and in the end, I'd say it killed her. I think the tension that all writers feel between the available time and the mountain of research and the deadline, that tension between deadline and research, ultimately killed Michelle McNamara.
And she never got to see that moment play out, which I can't imagine the satisfaction after that much work and having spoken to victims and knowing the toll it took on, that sort of crime for the women who did survive. That stays with you for your whole life.
It does. Look, It's an extraordinary documentary on so many levels. One of the reasons is that they've managed to get people, victims really, to talk frankly and really well in the way that some Americans do. They're very articulate, open people, Americans, and at every level of society. It's an interesting phenomenon. And so many of these women spoke openly and well about what had happened. And it's wonderful insight into the effects, the ripple effects of violent crimes, and how it trickles down through the generations and affects so many people in the end. At the very end of the documentary, and I don't, spoiler alert, we have this totally grueling scene of the killer's nephew, who's just an innocent poor guy whose uncle turns out to be a monster, in tears in front of the camera, describing how his own mother was raped as a little girl in Germany when the family were in the military, and how his Uncle Joe, who grew up to be the killer, had been a little boy at that time and he had seen this happen. And so this child, Joe D'Angelo, had been damaged, you would think, by what had happened in another country, in another world, in another era, and had carried those wounds and become, as a grown man, a monster himself.
I'm interested in all the work that you've done on crime and all the cases you've looked at, how you feel about the ethics of using someone's DNA when they've used it for quite an express cause, which is to determine connections to family members and potentially work out, oh, look, I've got some British background or whatever it is. Does the means justify the ends? Like, what does the end justify the means, rather? What do you think about that?
It doesn't worry me. I can see that it's going to worry someone somewhere, but I think you can mount an argument for the greater good, that we need to be able to stop people who are serial rapists and killers, in the same way that, if there's a typhoid Mary going around spreading a disease that's going to kill thousands of people, we need to be able to identify that person and stop them, even if it's notionally an invasion of privacy. I don't see a problem with it myself, but maybe others will.
Did D'Angelo, once they did knock on his door, and I believe he was living with his daughter and a granddaughter, did he confess? How did he respond to being arrested?
I think all we can say is that we know he confessed at some stage, because he pleaded guilty to pretty well everything, just took his medicine, didn't put anybody through the pain of a trial and having to prove it. He just fessed up. So whether he fessed up, that minute or that day, I don't know, but I suspect he did so fairly quickly. The guy I told you about, Raymond Edmonds, he to some extent was the same. I think he didn't volunteer some crimes that they didn't know that he'd done. So he kept some to himself. Whether D'Angelo did that too, I don't know. I mean, it's conceivable that D'Angelo did many more. How would we know?
Do you think, finally, that this story, in the unusual way in which they collected DNA evidence and, as you say, used their imagination in, a creative way, and in the end they found their man, that this will set a precedent in policing? Do you think that this will lead to some changes in how we track down criminals?
Clever use of DNA databases. Well, it's inevitable, probably. It's certainly tempting. I mean, who wouldn't try and do it if you knew that was one way to cross-check against, a lot of people? It would seem to be the way of the future. But there's one important thing we must remember. DNA, unlike fingerprints, is easily thrown around as, a loose hair or a piece of dandruff or almost anything. You walk through a shop or something, you'll be leaving your own DNA there, and that could be transferred onto a murder weapon or God only knows what. If you go to the homeware shop and pick up a carving knife and put it back down again, said it's too expensive, someone else buys it and it's later used in a murder and your DNA's on it, meaning that it's not a panacea. DNA should only ever be used in conjunction with other compelling evidence. No one should be convicted on DNA alone, because apart from anything else, there's that great temptation for people to frame other people, and that could be, I frame you, or for police believing that they've got the right person to, lift DNA and move it around in order to get a conviction against somebody that they think did the thing, but they can't prove it. I think we should keep that in mind, that it's a great tool, but it should never become our master when it comes to convictions.
The fear was so overwhelming. I'll never forget it. I figured if I was number 5, there's going to be probably a number 6, 7, 8, but I never realized it would be up to 50.
He really got off on power and control through fear. And so for me, being able to tell him, I don't care what you do, that was my way of telling him, you mean nothing to me. I'm not afraid of you.
The 6-part docuseries, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, is about one woman's obsessive search for the Golden State Killer, and it's available to stream now on Binge. You can find the link to the series in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our producer is Lem Zakaria. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.